There was a time when every modder was looking at this and thinking, you know what? Let's just take the clam out of its shell. Let's make a slab or a slate. And I was sitting there clutching my hinges and thinking, why would anyone do this? But if you guys remember, that all kind of changed with the arrival of the Gacha SP. And I was like, well, you know, it's a cute reason to take the hinges out. And now I am back with the newest revision of the Gacha SP. I'm your cool Uncle Marissa, and I'm really excited to bring you the final revision of Joseph Tompkins and Retrogame.evo's collaboration on the cutest Gameboy Advance ever. If you haven't seen it already, please at least watch the beginning of my first video on the first revision of the Gacha SP, just so you can get some context on the folks behind it. In summation, Joseph Tompkins is behind the design of the Gacha SP. He was inspired by the Playdate, which I have to make a video about. I will, I promise. It is one of my just most beloved consoles at this point. Also, hey, did I mention I have a Playdate? I did it in the last video. And he was inspired by that design to make a Game Boy Advance SP in the Playdate design. He worked with Retrogame.evo, Jonas, to build a PCB that attaches to the Game Boy Advance SP PCB to make this dream a reality. There have been about 4 revisions at this point. The first public revision, which is the one that I made, one that came soon after, which was essentially the same one, but with the addition of a speaker, and the final revision. And then there's a revision that's like final.docx.pdf.jpg for the version that uses a CNC'd front, so an aluminum front. And that will not be in this video, but fingers crossed, I might have a very short video in the future that will show the differences between the current version, which was the plastic or resin, and the CNC version. That aside, that's a lot of revisions, so that's a lot of changes. And I am happy to report from the get-go that all of the changes have been for the better. During my first video, while I was working on it and working on the build, Jonas and Joseph were both incredibly generous with their time with me, and they took a lot of the feedback I gave. They helped me work around any issues that I was having, and so I think that really helped it be a successful build. Seeing this new one, it's really exciting to see that a lot of the feedback I had has been implemented. Now, I don't know if that's, I don't want to flatter myself and say that that's a direct result of like just me. I'm sure it's more of a maybe universal experience with others who had been building it. I think especially because there's also like 2 ways of doing this. You can 3D print it at home where you have more control, or if you don't have a 3D printer, you can 3D print it with someone like PCBWay. And once again, this is a collaboration with PCBWay. Just like last time, they helped me make my dream a reality, plus with some cool new features. I'm sure you know by now that PCBWay offers all kinds of services from 3D printing, which you will need for the Gacha SP. You can 3D print in a variety of different materials such as resin, PLA, SLA, and there's tons of options for spray painting and dyeing as well. They also offer CNC machining for any metal projects and offer a variety of materials for that as well, plus a variety of ways to get your CNC project painted in a way that sticks. Speaking of paint, they have an insane array of colors you can choose from the Pantone library. It's absolutely dizzying. And obviously it wouldn't be PCBWay without PCBs. They offer very high quality PCBs with a variety of different colors of solder mask and silk screen. And speaking of which, they now offer UV printed PCBs, which is something that my rep offered to me. That on top of Jonas offering to make me a custom design on my PCB meant that we worked together to put this design that I drew up of a Psyduck on my PCB PCB. They now have very clear instructions on their website on how you can go about creating a file for your UV printed PCB. This is amazing. They didn't have this when we collaborated, but I let them know that we were a bit confused. And so it's really, really awesome to see them take this kind of feedback and actually provide a really nice explanation. The UV print is really crisp and clear. It's so cool to see my art on a PCB. You can see that there is some issues of like, there's a silk screen ghosting, which honestly works for Psyduck, and the button placement references I put on were also printed. This was just due to some confusion. The UV printing instructions weren't as clear, and so Jonas and I were confused, but they've since remedied that. So before we dive into this project, I kind of want to set expectations on what exactly you are going to get from this, what exactly this is, and what your skill level should be. So first off, this is a community project. It is not a retail project. It is a community project. It was built by Joseph and Jonas for no profit. It's out in the open. You can just go onto PCBWay, onto the pages, and get it all done for yourself. And that's something that I absolutely love about being a part of the Game Boy modding community, is there are so many just community projects that are so fun to do, just to challenge yourself or to discover something new, and you'll surprise yourself. I have a video on making the Game Boy Pocket Color, and I did not expect that to be so addictive. And also the Game Boy Pocket Color has become like my just day-to-day console at this point, which is also something that I didn't expect, because I'm not like a Game Boy Color aficionado as much as I am, for example, a Game Boy Advance aficionado. Secondly, what do you need to be able to do? So this does require through-hole soldering of wires onto fairly small points onto the board, but not so small that you would need a microscope. And these are not vias, they're all points, so it is easy to solder. Now the buttons, the switches for the buttons rather, are going to be SMD switches, so you will have an extremely difficult time trying to get to them with a soldering iron. It's possible, but you might go through a couple of switches, so I would highly recommend a hot plate or hot air from behind. And if you don't have those, just know it's gonna make things difficult. You should have a multimeter, that'll be super helpful. And honestly, the most difficult thing about this project is physically putting all the parts together. It's not the soldering, it's not any of that. It's just sandwiching everything together. So you need to be patient, you need to have a gentle hand, and you need to follow this guide. I'm really hoping that Joseph will put out a more official guide at some point, but I'm hoping that this can help us in the meantime. And if you have any questions, of course, please put them in the comments, but first watch the entire video. Otherwise, I will be grouchy. Speaking of grouchy, let's just get this out of the way, okay? You've got 6 foot tall hands. You walk into a store and you knock all the shelves down, they ask you to leave, you start weeping. You identify the most with that part in Alice in Wonderland where she drinks that potion and then she gets really big and she breaks the house. That's how your hands are. And so you're gonna be like, this looks really uncomfortable. Okay, then don't build it. But I have smaller hands. I don't have sausage fingers, I don't have meaty hands. And so the Game Boy Advance SP is comfortable for me. The Playdate is extremely comfortable for me. And again, this is very much inspired by the Playdate. So it's essentially the same ergonomics. Let's just get out of that out of the way. So what do you need in terms of parts? You need the front printed and you need the middle printed. Now, be very, very, very careful with printing these. I will put all of the links in the description. Click the right ones. So there are 2 versions of the fronts and the middles. There is the version for the resin or plastic or just the 3D printed one that I'm using in this video. Then there is the version that is for the CNC version. That's a different file for the front and a different file for the middle. And you can get those printed at PCBWay. You can follow my link or anywhere else. Maybe you have a 3D printer at home, whatever you choose. You will need the back of a Gameboy Advance SP shell. Any color you like, but just the back. You will need the regular Gameboy Advance SP triggers. You will need Gameboy Advance SP membranes. Now this is particularly important. We will be trimming the membranes and you will actually need 2 sets of membranes. And that is because the start and select buttons, instead of using the start and select membrane, we're going to use the trimmed version of the A and B membrane. So make sure you have 2 sets. In terms of the buttons, so the buttons are custom 3D printed because one issue with the last iteration was the regular Gameboy Advance SP buttons were too shallow. And so Joseph has designed new specific buttons for this final revision, and those will be 3D printed as well. I do have to note here that I completely forgot to 3D print my buttons. So I ended up 3D printing them in 2 other places, one at in a website and another one locally, completely transparent. PCBWay's prints blow both of these out of the water. Like, it doesn't make sense because one of them was cheaper, so it's like, okay, fair. But the other one, the local one, was like 3 times the price. So get your prints at PCBWay. I'm serious, their quality is really nice. You will also need a Gameboy Advance SP motherboard, a display, an IPS display, and of course a custom PCB for the GachaSP, which you can order directly from PCBWay. You will also need Gameboy Advance SP screws. I will write more about that in the description, but you should be able to complete the project with the regular screws that come with the Gameboy Advance SP. And so that being said, you need your regular Y-tip and Phillips tip screwdrivers, and you will need a soldering iron, and hot plate or hot air gun is extremely advised. You will also need wire. I'm using 28 or 30 gauge wire. I would highly recommend having wire in multiple different colors to make things easier for yourself, but I'm gonna throw in a tip later on what to do if you, for some reason, choose one wire color for everything. All right, that's enough talking. Let's get to it. So the very first thing we're gonna get out of the way is putting our switches onto the PCB. You can do that with these switches using a hot plate or hot air from the back of the PCB. I'm using a hot plate. I like to put on my solder paste with a pair of tweezers, and by like, I mean I did not clean my solder paste syringe early on, and so this is what I'm stuck doing. It works fine for me though. Regardless, what you will notice when you order your switches is that they are different now from the initial revision. They are still surface mount switches, but they have like the legs mainly just underneath as opposed to the side. And this time they are not just a better fit, but also the correct orientation. If you guys remember, the initial revision was not oriented correctly with the pads and it was a bit smaller. So I had to drag the solder to the legs, and therefore it was also harder getting the rubber membranes to align correctly with the switches. This is a great improvement. I will note the switches are still stiffer than an SP, and they are still very clicky. This is kind of, I think, where we are just in the switch market. We don't have a lot of options for switches that are soft like the SP one. So that's something that you just have to see, do I like this? The good thing is you do not need to strain your hand to press these switches. They are a huge improvement. When placing your switches, do not forget these switches do have an orientation. If you do not put them on in the correct orientation, they will not work. In this case, just the easy way to think about it is that on the left side and the right side, you have a bit of the gold. The top and the bottom are white. Once all of the switches are soldered down, I highly recommend using a multimeter to make sure that all of your connections are good and you don't have any bridges, and each switch is showing to have continuity with the point that is marked for it where the wire is going to go. The bottom two of each is going to be to ground. So you can check that they go to ground. Ground is the square one. And the top ones should be getting continuity with the buttons. And you can tell which buttons they are because they are listed on the back. And it goes in order. So up, down, left, right, start, select, BA. Correct orientation for these switches is the edges are on these sides. Now that's all the prep that we need to do on the board. So it's time to grab your Gameboy Advance SP parts. Now I'm just going to pull out everything from my old Gacha SP, which will also give us a good chance to take a closer look at what has changed from that early revision to this final revision. For our first comparison, let's take a quick listen to the old switches. So we can hear that they are quite loud and clicky, and at the same time they're quite shallow. And that shallowness and the hard switches both mean you have to press really hard. Now let's compare the middle pieces. One thing you'll notice is that the new version is slightly thicker. It doesn't have that bar in the center, but it also doesn't have a hole for you to run the wires through, which implies you should run all of your wires through that square cutout. I think getting rid of the side was a good idea because you can see that it's sort of messed up on the original version anyway. It's just too thin. There's also Joseph's little signature, which is really cute. Huge improvement to the front shell too is that the front shell is wider and just overall much sturdier than the original one, which is very thin and fragile. Quick note, please ignore the wiring that you're seeing. I ended up wiring this 3 times, and I will show you the best way to wire it up in a few steps later. But for now, I just want to talk about the buttons. So there are custom-made buttons again. That is a huge improvement as well. It fixes the issue of them being shallow. Of course, the shape of the Gacha SP overall has not changed, so we do still need to trim the membranes. My suggestion is to use a very nice, precise X-Acto knife and a ruler. And we'll be able to see how much we need to cut from the D-pad. The A and B membranes, you do not need to change a thing. The start and select membrane, the original membrane is too big. So what you'll need to do is actually take another A and B membrane and cut that into 2 circles and trim the circles. That's probably the most challenging of everything, but this is also a note that if you want to use membranes that are all the same color, or you're just using your OEM membranes, then make sure to buy an extra pack because you will need 2 A-B membranes. And here is the final result. The start select, as you can see, is not perfect, unfortunately. It's just needs a lot of precision, which I did miss. And now let's get to the wiring. I have wired this 3 different ways, and this is the way that I found was the easiest. Is first, take some nice long pieces of wire and start on the board. So wire them from the back and solder from the front. If you want to make things as easy as possible for yourself so you don't end up looking like Psyduck on the UV print, I would say use a different color of wire for each individual through hole. This will help you a lot given that you will no longer be able to see the wire designations once we've installed the board, but prior to soldering these wires onto the SP motherboard. While I'm doing this, let me just quickly talk about the other 2 ways I tried in case you're like, well, I bet this other way would be even better, and then you experience my experience. So the first way I did it was I wired from the motherboard onto the Gacha PCB. What that ended up causing was just a lot of mess. And I think a big reason for that is the slot for the wires to run through is no longer in this final design. You kind of have to take them, route them under a little ledge that is on the middle bit, and then route them around the giant square hole you have. So if you're installing the middle bit after you've soldered the wires to each PCB, you're gonna have a bit of a mess of wires. It's not going to be very clean, and you're gonna have trouble actually getting them to fit into that little notch. Therefore, you're gonna have wires sort of sitting on top of each other, and it's gonna cause issues with the GachaSP closing, and that's gonna cause issues with button presses, and it's just overall going to affect the build. The second way I did it was very short wires. So the wires they are only as long as they need to be to connect the Gacha PCB to the SP PCB. Now that was very clean, very nice. There wasn't anything between the two. Of course, that means that I completely forgot about the middle bit. Again, because the holes on the PCB are on the right side and the hole in the middle bit for the ribbons and the wires and everything to go around is on the left, you can't do them super short because you're gonna have to wire them around the middle part. And so I just wasted a lot of time doing a pretty perfect job in terms of length, but then realizing, oh, damn it, they are too short to actually go around, so the middle part no longer fits. So that's why I think this is the best way to do it. Once all of your wires are soldered, make sure they're very secure, because if they pop off, you're gonna have to open everything up again to get to this board, and it's just such a pain. So make sure they're nice and secure, touch them up if you need to, and then we're gonna take the PCB and we're gonna screw it into the front shell. Obviously remember to put your buttons in first, and once you screw it in, that's also a good opportunity just for you to press all the buttons, make sure everything is sitting correctly. You're not necessarily able to test it yet, but just to have that tactile test for yourself. So just like I was saying, these wires go through that rectangular cutout. Okay, and if you're nuts like me and used all one color wire, something I recommend doing is just taking some tape and marking what that wire belongs to. And then we can finally attach the middle bit. You just pop it in. As we can see, I've run the wires through the notch, through that lip in the front of the middle shell. And that is where you need to keep them so that they don't interfere with the sandwich. And for some reason, it was easier for me to put those wires in where they need to go before putting in the display. It might be the opposite for you, but make sure you don't forget the display. And then we're gonna screw the middle part of the sandwich down to the front of the sandwich to secure both the two of them as well as your PCB. And those 2 screw holes are on the bottom right and the bottom left. Speaking of screws, you should be able to do all of this with a set of Gameboy Advance SP screws. I will leave some details in the description of what screws go where, as shared with me by Joseph, in case you need a reference. Now what is left is to strip each wire if you haven't already, tin them, and then we can attach them to the points on the board. You can find the points on the board in this diagram, which you can also find on the PCBWay page for Jonas's PCB that we are using in the Gacha SP. You might notice that speaker that I'm using while I'm doing this. And it is currently seated where the Gameboy Advance SP speaker would be seated. This is another instance of me telling you, don't do that. So the Gacha SP final revision, as well as a mid revision that happened before the very first one that had no speaker, started using this speaker, and there is a slot for it in the front shell. Now, I don't know if this is just because, there's discrepancy in resin, but putting my speaker in the front shell caused the Gacha SP PCB to not be able to sit as well against the front shell, and therefore that affected my button presses. So I didn't want it there, so I was trying to experiment with where it should go. Where it is now is not where I put it eventually. I ended up putting it behind the screen. You will see in due time. And because I ended up doing this, I would also throw in the suggestion of what Joseph actually says he did with his own Gacha SP, which is he used a Nintendo Switch speaker. Nintendo Switch speaker is going to be louder than this cell phone speaker, and it is also going to be nice and thin. Because I did have a different cell phone speaker, it's the one that we used to upgrade the Miu Mini speaker, and unfortunately that was just too thick. Even when I tried to place it somewhere different than the original spot that it's designed for, it was just too big. So if sound fidelity, sound quality, sound volume matters to you, then I would go with the Switch speaker. If you are also having trouble fitting your cell phone speaker into the little slot. Once you're done wiring everything up, stick down some Kapton tape over the wire ends. This is mostly so that your wires stay in place. The Kapton tape will just help give them that extra level of security. Usually if a wire pops off, it's irritating, but the way that this build is and everything is so sandwiched together, if a wire pops off after you've finished, you're gonna cry. And I don't want you to do that. It's a bit hard to see, but the speaker right over here, first off, I recommend getting a lot of solder on each leg of the speaker and also stripping your wires to the extent where you kind of can cover the entire speaker leg with the stripped part of the wire, just for added security to make sure that there's more surface area covered and it doesn't pop up. And then I place the speaker right behind the screen in this little gap. And I imagine that's where you would put a switch speaker as well if you were to go that route. Honestly, the hardest part of this build is probably completing the sandwich. So, you know, I've got some wires that have like kind of come out from under that lip. So I'm using some tweezers to gently press them back into place. You obviously don't want to accidentally cut them because then you'll have to go rewind all the way back. And just making sure that everything falls into place. Then we're gonna screw the SP motherboard onto the sandwich, and you have 3 points on the SP motherboard that take screws, the middle, the left, and right. You only need to screw, you only can screw the left and the right screws. There is no post for you for the middle screw because that's where the screen is sitting. And this is a good point to pop in a battery and hold it there with your hand just to make sure that everything turns on. I'm also going to use the Better Button Tester ROM just to make sure that all of the buttons are working. I did have some trouble here because my hand kept slipping and the battery kept coming off the contacts, but just trust me that all my buttons worked. Now, after I did this test, I forgot to film the final putting everything together. So I just want to go over from beginning to end how everything attaches to each other. So you have the front frame, you obviously put in your buttons and membranes, and then you wire everything to the PCB and you screw that in with these posts on the left and right. Next, we put the middle part in and make sure you've got all your wires under the lip that's on the front of the middle part and running through this square. Of course, remember the display is also going to be in here at this point. And then we'll have that screwed in with the bottom left and right screws. And the PCB will go on top of there, and we screw those 2 PCB holes that I'd mentioned. You also need to screw these top 3 screws to help hold the middle, the display, and the front. And then we have the back of an OEM Gameboy Advance SP. Don't forget your little silver square that goes in that hole. And don't forget the triggers. Now, I don't know if this is because my middle was spray painted by PCBWay, upon my request, obviously, but it's quite challenging getting the rods from the triggers to sit in properly. So that might take a bit more force. And of course, the regular SP screws go into the back. That's pretty self-explanatory, and you're done. All right, now let's do some gameplay testing. This time let's try testing with Pokemon Sapphire.
Just kidding, sucker, it's Mr. Driller.
right, and we are finished. We have completed the final, for real now, .final.final.docx.doc.docx.pdf of the Gacha SP. It is the ultimate like burrito making experience for Game Boy mods, I think. You know, when people cater with Chipotle, that used to be a really big thing a while ago. I remember I would always be like, yeah, I'm gonna make myself a burrito, and it would just be collapsing and falling out, and I would be a terrible Chipotle employee. And that's how it can feel with putting the Gacha SP together. But with the patience and routing everything correctly, you'll get there. And I do hope that this video was helpful and maybe giving some hints here and there on where to put what for the most optimal burrito arrangement. Now, while we're here, a quick size comparison. So the Gacha SP is, of course, the same size as the Gameboy Advance SP. They use the same back, therefore the front is the same size. But here's the moment that you've been waiting for. I compared it to other consoles in my last one. I compared it to my phone, and I wanted to compare it to a Playdate, but I couldn't because I didn't have a Playdate, but now I have a Playdate. It's slightly bigger than a Playdate, just a wee bit. It's definitely thicker than a Playdate, but there's more going on inside. I honestly think I went for the yellow because I was just subliminally like, Playdate, Playdate, Playdate. Anyway, let's talk about, first off, I want to just reiterate the things that I really appreciated in terms of changes. Number one, the structural integrity. Leaps and bounds. The front plate is much wider on the edges than it used to be. Therefore, you're not worried about it cracking. The cracking especially was really scary where the top 3 screws are because it was so thin. Then we have the middle bit. The middle, the little fine border on this side is gone. And that I think is for the best because it's one less thing that could crack. Plus, that's not actually messing up any sort of routing. In terms of routing, the really little slot where the wires go through has been filled in. Now, at first, I was a little confused by that decision because I liked how that allowed for a very clear arrangement of the wires. And so I thought, oh, but the lip isn't gonna hold them completely, the way that a slot would. But I actually think that that was a great change because with the slot, you had to sort of have your wires be the perfect length to not get mushed and create more distance and more tension between the board and everything else. Whereas with this, because there's no slot and you just push them in, you have a lot more leeway with how the wires can travel around, and therefore you can have that be flatter and therefore more manageable and less stressful. So A+ with that too. A big change was the switches. Installing them was way easier because they're the correct orientation, they fit correctly on the footprint, and so it's just a breeze. I remember, and if you'd seen my video on it, you would know I had to resolder the switches on the first revision a few times to get them lined up with the membranes. I sort of had to keep cross-checking my work, which is fine, but it's not the perfect solution. And so this is a wonderful solution, and they are not a pain to press either. And I feel like they're closer to the SP switches. Also, I guess it's a pro that it has a speaker, but it's had a speaker since the update to the first revision. So that's nothing new, that's just like a new for me thing. But then that takes us to things that I have suggestions on for you. My first suggestion, which is a little bit hesitant because I don't have solid proof, but fingers crossed I will soon, and I'll make a little update video. But I would say if you are going to make this, go with CNC. I love plastic, I love the warmth of plastic, but there's just so much going on here that everything kind of needs to be in the perfect place that I think the malleability of resin, which is absolutely a blessing, does bring with that a little bit of a curse as well. I haven't had the resin break on me or anything in this one because of the modifications that have been made. But you know, it's just like there's places where it's a little warped and you have to let it settle, things like that. Or, you know, if you force something in and you have like the wires get caught, the resin's like, yeah, sure, let's do that. And then maybe you don't realize because the resin's just so cooperative that you're like, oh, wait, why aren't my buttons pressing perfectly? And it's like, oh crap, like the wires left the little lip that they're supposed to sit in and they went down and now, but just resin's so cooperative. Speaking of cooperation though, if you are planning to open up this build a lot, just be careful if you're using resin. Resin only takes a certain number of being opened and closed before the screw posts start to crumble. It's a delicate material, so if you feel like that's something you're going to keep doing, I would say don't get resin. If you are going to get resin, I highly recommend not making a transparent build because you have to cut the membranes and there's not a lot of PCB in the front for you to display. That I think going with an opaque solution will also just allow you more freedom in working on the inside without worrying how that's going to look. The back is honestly where all the things are happening. So if you want to go transparent on the back. And you know, you can see your game when it's slotted in. It's a neat thing. I actually did want to go opaque this time, but I could not resist the UV printed PCB, so that's why I'm here. And then as I mentioned, also in terms of audio for the speaker, this speaker is fine for me. If you want a louder speaker, which you know is a completely valid concern, go with the Nintendo Switch speaker or something similar and push it behind where the screen is, which is where I put mine. Again, I will find out if the aluminum version, the CNC version, if there's more space for the speaker in the front, because again, I do wonder if that just has to do with the malleability of resin, that maybe my little speaker hole was a little too small. And on that note, let me just do a quick sound test here, just so you know what it's like at its loudest. So the actual Gameboy Advance SP is like deafening by comparison, but that is absolutely up to you. Now finally, I just want to put in like my wish list, which is just one thing. So I think that clicky switches have never really been for me. The most clicky that I like is the SP switches. And they're very like, there's a depth to their clickiness. They're like bass heavy clicky, but a lot of clicky switches, especially nowadays, seem to be treble heavy clicky. I don't know if that makes sense to you. And so are these. So I think for me, it would have been perfect if, like the Playdate, it had soft rubber membrane contacts. I'm not the maker, so I don't know how difficult or easy that is, but I think that's what would make it perfect for me. And on that note of perfection, where do I think this sits in terms of what you have? If you want your very first Game Boy Advance to play all the Game Boy Advance games, this isn't gonna be it. Because this is fun. This is like a fun piece to have. And I think that it's really fun to play arcade games on, for example, like Mr. Driller, like Tetris, like, you know, it has that feedback with the clickiness. But I don't know if it's great for just, imagine you're lying in bed and your partner's with you and they're asleep, you know, you still got the clickies. And that's a criticism, I think, of a lot of clicky devices. So I would say that no, it shouldn't be your only Game Boy Advance, but if you're looking to expand your collection or you want something fun to play arcade games on and stuff, it's perfect. Yeah, it's a really rewarding project, and I'm really grateful to Joseph and Jonas for bringing it to the community and, you know, for not abandoning it, because they could have just left it on version 1, but they kept going and they made it even better, and that's really cool. The clicky switches actually makes me think of the new Anbernic emulation device that's a clone of the SP. Like, they couldn't even get the clicky switches right. Like, people are like, they're too loud. Also, I can't get over the fact that it doesn't play Game Boy Advance games on the correct aspect ratio. Like, you would think if you're close. Anyway, the CPU and the battery are on top of each other, so be careful if you have one. I'm going on a tangent. Now, what if you want one, but you don't have the skills, time, interests, etc. to build one? Well, I have good news for you. There are 2 licensed builders and sellers of the Gacha SP, Boys Mods and Northwest Electronics, who I will also make sure to include in the description. After recording this, I realized Modding Marius is now a licensed builder, so that is also someone to add to the list, especially if you're in France. If you're not able to build one yourself, please try and get it from them, because that way there is actually money going to the creators of this project, and you're not in danger of falling for any sort of scam. That is to say that a company did actually rip off this design using the available stuff on PCBWay and just, you know, shared it as their own. I don't know if they're planning on moving forward further with it, but when Joseph contacted them, they pretty much said, so what? So let's not encourage that kind of behavior. But that's all I have for now. Again, I'm so happy that this project has come so far. A big thank you to Joseph for putting this design and many others just out in the world for folks to be able to print and use and just delight in. Thank you so much to Retrogame.evo for building the custom PCB for this, for working with me to UV print the PCB, even though we definitely faced some challenges, but I think it came out really cute ultimately. And a huge thank you to PCBWay for the parts and for working with me on this. PCBWay's quality is always stellar. My rep is incredibly kind and wonderful, and just the service is very attentive and awesome. So I think that they're a fantastic place to go for any of your PCB or 3D printing or CNC needs, and the fact that anyone who uploads projects onto PCBWay does get a cut when someone orders through them is just very supportive of the community. In terms of what comes next, I'm really hoping to do a follow-up with this with the aluminum shell, and other than that, I am keeping an eye on some really cool projects that Joseph has coming out, one of which is with Retrogame.evo, and it is the teeniest, tiniest monitor that runs on Raspberry Pi and takes HDMI. So I'm very excited for that, and I can't wait. Thank you so much, you guys, for watching, and thank you so much for visiting Cool Uncle's house. Don't forget that Cool Uncle loves you, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!